A mountain man and his horse found a deserted cabin, and what they found in the well was shocking. The wind howls across the high country. Snow gathers on the roof of a cabin no soul has entered for years. But when a lonely wanderer lowers a bucket into the well, what rises is no water, but a locked chest. Inside letters, a baby's blanket, and a deed that could change everything. But this discovery is no blessing. It's a curse. Powerful men will kill to bury the truth, and caught between a widow's tears, a boy's failing breath, and a rancher's rage. The mountain man must choose, keep silent, or fight for justice with nothing but his faith and his courage. The church bell tolls. Hooves, thunder. A town holds its breath. Will one man's choice restore hope or see him buried beside the well that held its secrets? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The autumn wind whistled through the gaps in the cabin's logs as Silas McGrath set the dripping cedar chest on the rough-hewn table. Water pooled beneath it, soaking into the weathered wood. The oilcloth wrapping had protected it well. Though the edges were frayed from years underwater, Silas ran his calloused hands over the chest's surface, feeling the smooth cedar beneath the cloth. The craftsmanship spoke of care, dovetailed corners, and brass fittings that had turned green with age. His fingers found a small brass latch, still solid despite its time in the well. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, Bramble nickered softly in response to a distant coyote's call. Silas glanced at the window, where fat snowflakes had begun to fall against the darkening sky. "Reckon whoever put you down there had their reasons," he muttered, carefully unwrapping the oilcloth. The fabric was good quality, the kind used by traders to protect valuable goods. Someone had taken great care to preserve whatever lay inside. From his saddlebag, Silas retrieved a tin oil lamp and set it on the table. The warm light revealed intricate carvings on the chest's lid, leaves, and vines that curved around the edges. Not the work of an amateur, but someone who knew their craft. The latch opened with a soft click. Silas paused, aware that he was about to intrude on someone's private affairs. In his 20 years as a mountain man, he'd learned that secrets often carried weight and sometimes danger. But the chest had been abandoned, left to the water and darkness. Perhaps its contents needed to see light again. He lifted the lid slowly. The hinges creaked, protesting years of disuse. Inside, wrapped in more oilcloth, lay several bundles. Silas carefully lifted out the first one, noting its weight and solid feel. As he unwrapped it, the lamplight caught the gleam of silver. A photograph frame emerged, tarnished but intact. Through the spotty glass, a family gazed back at him, a man in his Sunday best, a woman in a Hickolar dress, and 3 young children arranged carefully before them. Their faces were solemn, as folks often were for photographs, but there was warmth in their eyes. The sight stirred something in Silas's chest. His own family daguerreotype had burned with everything else that terrible night, leaving him with only memories that grew fainter with each passing year. He set the frame aside gently, respecting the frozen moment of another family's history. The next bundle revealed letters, their paper yellowed but preserved by careful wrapping. The handwriting was elegant, speaking of education and refinement. Silas didn't read them. Some privacies deserved to remain unbroken, but he noted the dates, 1867 to 1872. 6 years of someone's life. Sealed away in darkness, beneath the letters lay a leather-bound Bible. Its pages gilt-edged, and surprisingly, a name was inscribed on the first page in the same careful hand as the letters Elizabeth Thorne, 1865. A pressed flower fell from between the pages, a mountain columbine, its purple petals faded but still recognizable. The final bundle was the heaviest. Silas unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small strongbox made of iron. Unlike the chest, this was meant for security rather than beauty. Its key was missing, and Silas left it locked. Some questions weren't his to answer as he carefully rewrapped each item. Silas's mind turned to the cabin's former inhabitants. The furniture spoke of simple living, a wooden rocker by the hearth, shelves lined with dust-covered jars, a set of hand-forged tools hanging from pegs. But the chest's contents hinted at a deeper story. Someone had taken great care to preserve these memories before hiding them away. The wind grew stronger, rattling the cabin's shutters. Bramble stomped in the lean-to, sensing the approaching storm. Silas added another log to the fire, watching sparks rise up the chimney. The chest sat on the table, its contents rewrapped, but no longer hidden in darkness. He touched the brass latch thoughtfully. Tomorrow, he'd need to decide what to do with his discovery. For now, the chest and its secrets would rest here, where at least they were dry and safe from the elements. Silas spread his bedroll near the hearth, the warmth of the fire at his back. The questions would keep until morning. Why had someone hidden their precious memories in a well? What had driven them from this cabin, and why hadn't they returned? The answers lay somewhere in those letters and photographs, in that locked strongbox. But Silas wasn't sure he had the right to seek them out. The snow fell harder outside, blanketing the world in white silence. Inside the cabin, the lamp burned low, its light catching the cedar chest's carved leaves and casting them in shadow. Silas lay awake, listening to the fire's crackle and Bramble's occasional movements. While the chest kept its vigil on the table, its long-submerged secrets finally returned to the world of light and air. Dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-dusted landscape in soft pink light. Silas stirred from his bedroll, the cabin's chill air nipping at his face. He'd kept the fire low through the night, and now only embers glowed in the hearth. The cedar chest sat where he'd left it, on the table, its presence drawing his eyes like a lodestone. First things first, though. Coffee would help clear his mind for whatever the morning might bring. Silas moved with practiced efficiency, stoking the fire and setting his battered coffee pot near the flames. The familiar aroma of brewing coffee soon filled the small cabin, mixing with wood smoke and the lingering dampness from yesterday's snow. While the coffee perked, he returned to the chest. The brass latch opened easier now, no longer stiff from its long soaking. Morning light streaming through the cabin's grimy window revealed details he'd missed by lamplight.inside. The letters were bound with faded blue ribbon. The paper edges softened with age but still intact thanks to the oilcloth's protection. Beside them lay a child's Bible, small enough to fit in a pocket. Its leather cover was worn smooth at the corners. Speaking of frequent handling, when Silas carefully opened it, pressed flowers fell into his palm, yellow Indian paintbrush, and tiny white snowdrops. Their colors faded, but still visible. A beaded baby blanket came next, carefully folded. The intricate pattern showed mountains and stars in blue and white beads, with darker beads forming flowing rivers between them. The craftsmanship was exceptional, each tiny bead perfectly placed. This was no trading post goods. This was someone's heritage worked in thread and glass dot at the bottom of the chest. Wrapped in an extra layer of oilcloth, Silas found a single sheet of paper. The official letterhead marked it as Indian Agency Correspondence, dated 1873. The formal language granted water rights to a natural spring to Sarah Birdwoman. Being of Comanche birth and proper standing, the agent's signature and seal were clear despite water stains at the paper's edge. Silas sat back, coffee forgotten. This wasn't just discarded belongings. This was proof of someone's claim to water, the most precious resource in these parts. The care taken to preserve these items spoke volumes. Someone had hidden their treasures here, meaning to return. The sound of distant hoofbeats broke his contemplation. Moving quickly to the window, Silas wiped a clear spot in the frost-covered glass. 3 riders approached the cabin, their horses' breath steaming in the cold morning air. They rode with purpose, scanning the ground as they came. Without hesitation, Silas gathered everything back into the chest. The hearth still held warm ashes from the night's fire. Working swiftly, he scraped them aside, set the chest in the shallow depression, and covered it with ashes and half-burned wood. Just as he straightened up, bootsteps sounded on the cabin's porch. The door creaked open. 3 men filled the doorway, dressed in ranch gear. The leader, a hard-faced man with a silver-streaked mustache, took in the cabin's interior with narrow eyes. "Mornin'," he said. "Didn't expect to find anyone up here." Silas nodded, keeping his stance relaxed. "Just waiting out the weather. Coffee's hot if you're interested." "Coffee's hot if you're interested." The second man, younger and wearing a foreman's vest, stepped inside. "Been tracking through these hills 3 days now." He glanced at the well through the window, checking all the old homesteads. "Looking for strays?" Silas asked, though he already suspected otherwise. The third man snorted. "Looking for paper? Deed to a spring hidden by that squaw woman before she lit out." He spat the words with casual contempt. "You seen anything like that, old-timer?" "Can't say that I have." Silas poured coffee into his tin cup, movements deliberately slow. "Found the place empty when I rode in last night." The men moved through the cabin, checking corners and shelves. Their casual manner couldn't hide their thoroughness. The leader paused by the hearth, and Silas felt sweat prickle between his shoulders, despite the morning chill. "Well, keep an eye out," the foreman said finally. "That deed shows up, there's reward money waiting at the Double Bar Ranch." He touched his hat brim, much obliged for the offer of coffee. The chest's contents felt heavier now, weighted with new understanding. Someone named Sarah Birdwoman had legal claim to water in these hills, valuable enough that men were still searching 5 years later. He stared at the ash-covered hearth, unease settling in his gut. The chest wasn't just a curious find anymore. It was dangerous proof of someone's rights, and he was now caught up in its story whether he wanted to be or not. The morning sun climbed higher as Silas stood in the cabin doorway, watching bramble graze on patches of dry grass poking through the snow. His horse's quiet presence and steady movements helped settle his troubled thoughts. The cedar chest weighed on his mind heavier than its physical weight had when he'd pulled it from the well. He could leave it here, bury it back in the well, or even deeper in the ground. Walk away from whatever trouble brewed around that spring deed. Plenty of folks would say that was the sensible choice. Bramble lifted his head, dark eyes meeting Silas's gaze. The horse's steady look seemed to judge him, reminding him of simpler truths learned long ago. Right was right, and wrong was wrong, no matter how inconvenient. Silas sighed, his breath frosting in the cold air. "Reckon you're right, old friend. Can't just leave it." He packed his gear with careful efficiency, leaving the cabin as he'd found it. The chest, wrapped again in oilcloth, fit snugly in his saddlebags. 2 days' ride would take him to the Indian Agency office where that deed had been signed. Seemed as good a place as any to start searching for answers. The trail wound through stands of pine and aspen, climbing over one ridge and down into the next valley. Silas kept alert, watching for signs of the ranch riders, but the day passed quietly. When darkness approached, he made camp in a sheltered hollow, tending to bramble before seeing to his own needs. The small fire cast dancing shadows as Silas settled against his saddle. He drew out the packet of letters, handling them with careful respect. The handwriting was neat, but unpracticed, each word formed with deliberate care. "Dear sister," the first letter began, "the winter grows long, but little Wolf grows stronger each day. He asks for his father, and I tell him the stories of how brave Joseph was, how he died protecting our right to stay on this land. The ranchmen say we must sell the spring, but the agent gave us papers. I pray we can hold on until spring brings grass again." The letter was signed simply Taya. Each subsequent page revealed more of her story. A young Comanche mother's struggled to keep her home after her husband's death. Her words carried dignity despite their simple phrasing, shot through with determination to build a future for her son. The next day's ride brought colder weather, wind cutting through Silas's coat as clouds built over the mountains. He made better time on the lower trails, and by evening the second day, lights from the way station glowed ahead. The rough buildings served as a stop for freight wagons, offering basic supplies and news to travelers. Inside, warmth from a pot-bellied stove pushed back the evening chill. A clerk looked up from his ledger as Silas stamped snow from his boots. "Evening," Silas said, setting his hat on the counter. "Need some information about folks who might have lived up near Timber Ridge Cabin few years back. Comanche woman and her boy." The clerk's face changed, something like old anger crossing his features. "You mean Taya and little Joseph? Remember them well enough. Shame what happened to that family. Tell me about it." Silas kept his voice casual, though his attention sharpened. "Good folks, them. Joseph, the father, he'd worked as a scout for the cavalry, earned that land fair and square. After he died, Taya kept on raising their boy, tending that spring." The clerk spat into a bucket. "Then Double Bar Ranch decided they wanted that water. Couldn't run her off legal on account of her deed, so they poisoned her well instead. Claimed it was an accident with some dead cattle upstream, but everybody knew better." Silas felt his jaw tighten. "What became of them?" "Taya and the boy left before winter set in. The word was they headed south, toward her mother's people. Haven't heard tell of them since." The clerk shook his head. "Law don't work the same for everybody, it seems like that night. Lying in the way station's basic lodging, Silas stared at the rough-hewn ceiling. The chest's contents felt like burning coals in his saddlebags. A deed that could make things right. Letters that told a story of injustice. And a mother's desperate effort to hold on to something honest for her son. His path ahead lay clear now. Though it wouldn't be easy. He'd find Taya and her boy, return what was rightfully theirs. Maybe then the weight in his chest would ease. The one that had settled there when those ranch riders spoke so casually of stealing a widow's water rights that morning would bring decisions about which direction to ride. Who'd to ask for word of a Comanche woman and her son? But the important choice, the one between walking, away, and standing up, that decision was already made. The afternoon sun hung low as Silas guided. Brambled toward the Indian Agency buildings. A cluster of weathered wooden structures hunched against the autumn wind, their windows reflecting dull light. 2 soldiers lounged near the entrance, rifles propped against the wall. Their eyes followed Silas as he dismounted and tied Bramble to the hitching post. Inside, the office smelled of dust and old paper. A clerk sat behind a scarred desk, his spectacles catching the light as he looked up from a stack of forms. Lines creased his face, speaking of too many hours, managing the weight of government business. The clerk's voice carried the flatness of someone who'd said those words too many times to count. Silas removed his hat, drawing the deed from his coat. Need to verify something, if you would. He placed the document carefully on the desk. Deed to a spring, issued some years back. The clerk's tired eyes sharpened as he examined the paper. His fingers traced the official stamps and signatures with practiced care. This is genuine enough. Remember when we issued it? He glanced up at Silas. Though it wasn't to you. No, sir, it wasn't. Silas kept his voice steady. Belongs to a woman named Taya. I aim to return it to her, Taya. Recognition crossed the clerk's face. The Comanche widow, she's still around, actually, living in the tent camp outside town. He hesitated, then added more quietly, life's been hard for that family. Good woman, though. Takes in washing, tends to sick folks. Her boy helps where he can. Could you point me toward their camp? The clerk drew a rough map on a scrap of paper. Follow the creek south, past where the cottonwoods thin out. But mind yourself on that road. Double bar riders come through regular and they ain't friendly to folks asking about Taya or that spring. Silas nodded his thanks, tucking both deed and map safely away. Outside, he mounted Bramble and turned south, keeping to the tree line where possible. The afternoon light stretched shadows across the trail as he rode, every approaching hoofbeat making him alert for ranch riders. The tent camp appeared as the sun touched the western hills. Scattered canvas shelters, patched and weather-stained, clustered in the shelter of a low-rise. Thin streams of cooking smoke rose straight in the still evening air. Children's voices carried across the camp, mixing with the sound of someone chopping wood. Silas dismounted at the camp's edge, leading Bramble slowly between the tents. A few people paused in their evening tasks to watch him pass, their faces guarded. He understood their caution. Strangers rarely brought good news to such places near the center of the camp. A woman stood outside a well-kept tent, stirring a pot of beans suspended over a small fire. Her dark hair was bound back neatly, and though her dress was worn, it was carefully mended. A boy of perhaps 8 years old stood close beside her, one of her hands resting protectively on his shoulder as she watched Silas approach. This had to be Taya. The way she held herself, the quiet dignity in her bearing, matched the spirit he'd felt in her letters. Her eyes met his directly, neither challenging nor fearful, simply waiting to learn his purpose. Silas stopped a respectful distance away. Evening, ma'am. He reached slowly into his saddlebag, drawing out the beaded blanket. The firelight caught the careful patterns worked into the leather, making them seem to dance. Reckon this might belong to you. Taya's body went still. Her hand tightened on her son's shoulder, and the boy looked up at her questioningly. For a long moment, she just stared at the blanket, emotions playing across her face too quickly to read. Where did you find this? Her voice was soft but clear, each word carefully formed. Cabin up on Timber Ridge, hidden in the well, along with some other things that belonged to you. Silas held the blanket out, letting her see it properly in the fading light. Made this for your boy, didn't you? Taya's free hand reached out, fingers trembling slightly as they touched the beadwork. I wrapped him in it the day he was born. His father said, she swallowed hard, said the pattern would guide him home if he ever got lost. The boy, young Joseph, pressed closer to his mother's side, his eyes fixed on the blanket. I remember that, he whispered. From before, Silas saw the moment trust began to win over caution in Taya's expression. She reached out and took the blanket, holding it close against her chest. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, though her gaze remained questioning. There's more, Silas said quietly, including something that might help make things right. The evening shadows lengthened as Silas settled on a weathered log near Taya's cooking fire. The flames cast dancing light across their faces, while overhead, the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky. Joseph sat cross-legged on a blanket, the small Bible cradled in his hands as if it were made of precious glass. Taya held one of her recovered letters, the paper rustling softly as she smoothed it flat. Her fingers traced the careful writing, remembering the pot of beans bubbled quietly over the fire, filling the air with a homey scent that reminded Silas of simpler times. I wrote this the week after they came, Taya said, her voice low but clear in the gathering dusk. She began to read, the words trembling slightly. Dear sister, the ranchers returned today. They say the water rights were never truly mine, that a Comanche woman cannot hold deed to white man's land. But this spring, it knew my people long before papers marked boundaries. She paused, drawing a steadying breath. Joseph looked up from the Bible, his young face serious in the firelight. Mother, he whispered, remember what the good book says? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Taya finished softly, reaching to touch her son's hair. You remember well, little one. Silas leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Tell me what happened at the spring, he said gently. Taya, single quotes as hands tightened on the letter. The double-bar men came first with warnings, then threats. When I wouldn't leave, they poisoned our well. Pain flickered across her face. Our goats sickened. Joseph took fever from the water. I had no choice but to go, believing the spring was lost to us forever. The deed still holds weight, Silas said firmly. I checked with the agency clerk. Your claim is legal and binding. No rancher can take that from you. Legal means little when might makes right. Taya responded, bitterness edging her words. Papers didn't stop them before. A soft nickering interrupted them. Bramble had wandered closer to their fire, drawn perhaps by the warmth or the smell of cooking. The big horse stretched his neck toward Joseph, nostrils flaring gently. The boy's face lit up as Bramble's velvet muzzle, noting how the tension eased from Taya's shoulders as she watched her son carefully stroke the horse's nose. Bramble's a good judge of character. What would you suggest? Taya asked after a moment, her voice thoughtful, even with the deed. The double bar won't simply step aside. I can speak for you at the judge's office, Silas offered. Tell how I found the deed. Verify your claim. My word as a white man might carry weight with them. Much as that galls me to say, Taya stood, her shadow tall against the firelight. No, she said firmly, not alone. When Silas looked up questioningly, she continued, if we go to the judge, I must stand beside you. My dignity, my people's dignity, requires that I speak for myself. I won't hide behind another's voice, even one who means well. Silas nodded slowly, respect deepening. Reckon you're right about that. A person should stand for their own truth. Then we are agreed, Taya asked, studying his face in the flickering light. You'll help me claim what's rightfully mine, but as an ally, not a savior. Yes, ma'am, Silas replied simply. We can ride into town at dawn if that suits you. Joseph looked up from where he still petted Bramble. Can I come too, mother? Please. Taya considered her son thoughtfully. Yes, she decided. You should see this. Should know that justice, though slow, can still come. She turned back to Silas. We'll be ready at first light. The fire crackled, softly between them as they settled into companionable silence. Joseph opened the Bible again, his small voice carrying clearly as he read favorite verses. Taya stirred the beans one last time and began ladling them into tin bowls. Offering the first to Silas with quiet grace as they ate, Silas watched mother and son, noting the strength that ran deep in both of them. Not just survival, he realized, but dignity kept alive like a banked fire through the darkest nights. Come morning, they would ride to town together, not as supplicants, but as equals seeking justice. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and unchanging. As they made their plans for dawn, the autumn sun crept above the eastern horizon, painting the sky in soft rose and gold. Silas adjusted Bramble's saddle, while Taya helped Joseph mount behind her on their borrowed pony. The morning air held a bite that promised winter wasn't far off. They set out single file along the narrow trail. Silas, leading the way, the cedar chest, wrapped securely in oilcloth, rode behind his saddle. Bramble's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust that drifted away on the morning breeze as they rode. The sun climbed higher, warming their backs. The steady clip-clop of hooves and creak of leather created a rhythm that seemed to loosen something in Taya's spirit. She began to speak, her voice carrying clearly to where Silas rode ahead. "My husband Daniel was a good man," she said, one hand resting protectively on Joseph's leg where he sat behind her. "He tried to bridge two worlds, working as a scout for the cavalry while keeping our ways." She paused, gathering her thoughts. 3 years ago, there was a misunderstanding between soldiers and some of our hunters. Daniel rode out to translate, to keep peace. Silas nodded, showing he listened, though he kept his eyes on the trail ahead. The soldiers were young, angry, afraid of shadows. Taya's voice grew tight with old pain. They shot first, before Daniel could explain. Called it an accident afterward, but that didn't bring him back to us. Joseph's small arms tightened around his mother's waist. The boy had been too young to remember, but he knew the story well. "I used to pray every day," Taya continued after a while, "for understanding, for peace between peoples. But lately, she looked down at her hands on the reins. Lately, the words don't come so easy. When they poisoned our well, took our home, I wondered if anyone listened. Reckon sometimes the answer to prayer wears dusty boots instead of angel wings." Silas said quietly, thinking of the cedar chest he carried. The sun stood high when they finally rode into town. The street was busy with wagons and townspeople going about their morning business. Conversations died as they passed. Heads turned to stare at the unusual sight, a mountain man riding beside a Comanche woman and child. Silas noticed the different faces they passed. Some showed pity, soft and condescending. Others wore harder looks, scorn, disapproval, even anger. A few nodded cautiously, respect warming their eyes. The judge's office sat in a neat wooden building near the center of town. Silas helped Taya and Joseph dismount, then lifted down the cedar chest. They climbed the steps together, boots echoing on the wooden boards. Inside, afternoon light streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes and golden beams. The judge, a gray-haired man with wire-rimmed spectacles, sat at his desk. Beside him stood Reverend Matthews, the local preacher, deep in conversation. Both men looked up as Silas and Taya entered. Joseph pressed close to his mother's side, clutching the small Bible they'd found in the chest. "Your Honor," Silas said, setting the chest on a nearby table. "We've come about a matter of water rights," the judge peered at them over his spectacles while Silas carefully unwrapped the chest. He explained how he'd found it, then produced the deed. The judge examined it closely, lips moving as he read. "This is properly executed," he said finally, surprise clear in his voice. "Signed and sealed by the Indian Agency itself. The spring rights were legally granted to Mrs. Taya, running water. Those ranchers had no right to drive her off." Silas said firmly, "They poisoned her well, threatened her family." The preacher stepped forward, drawn by Joseph's Bible. The boy offered it shyly, and Reverend Matthews handled it with care, noting the pressed flowers between its pages. "These letters to the preacher," said, scanning them quickly, "they show a family's life, their faith, their struggle to build something lasting." He looked at Taya. "You've kept your dignity through great hardship. Madame, the law is clear in this case," the judge declared, tapping the deed. "These water rights were properly granted and never rescinded. No one had authority to seize this property. Justice and mercy should walk hand in hand," Reverend Matthews added. "When we fail to uphold the rights of the weakest among us, we diminish our own humanity." Taya stood straighter, her eyes bright with unshed tears. For the first time since losing her home, hope bloomed in her heart. She felt Joseph's small hand slip into hers and squeezed it gently. The judge reached for his pen. "Let me write an order restoring your rights, Mrs. Runningwater. No one will legally dispute your claim after this." Silas watched Taya's face as the judge's pen scratched across paper. The morning's long ride, the weight of her story, the stares of townspeople, all had led to this moment of vindication. Though challenges likely still lay ahead, justice had finally begun to turn in her favor. Word spread through town like wildfire after the morning's events at the judge's office. By afternoon, the streets hummed with talk of the upcoming hearing. Shopkeepers gathered in doorways, sharing opinions in hushed voices. Women paused their errands to discuss the news over garden fences. Outside the general store, Silas kept a watchful eye while Taya purchased supplies with the few coins she had saved. Through the store's dusty window, he could see townsfolk's reactions to her presence. Some turned away, faces hard with disapproval. Others offered small nods of acknowledgement. "My grandpa homesteaded here," an older woman said to her friend as they passed. "Lost to children before we found clean water. No one should suffer that, Indian or not." "But them ranchers need that spring for their cattle," her companion argued. "What about their rights?" Silas shifted his weight, keeping Bramble between Taya and any unfriendly looks. The horse's solid presence seemed to comfort her as she emerged from the store. Clutching a small paper sack of cornmeal, they made their way back to the camp outside town, where other displaced families had erected canvas shelters. The afternoon sun beat down harsh and hot despite the season. Joseph sat quiet in the shade of their tent, his usual energy dampened. "You feeling poorly, son?" Silas asked, noting the boy's flushed cheeks. Taya knelt beside Joseph, touching his forehead. "He helped fetch water this morning," she said, worry creasing her brow. "The creek near camp runs muddy now, as if to confirm their fears." Joseph doubled over in a fit of coughing. The sound rattled deep in his chest, and Taya's face went pale with concern. "That water ain't fit to drink," Silas said, already reaching for his canteen. "There's a clean creek I passed yesterday, about an hour's ride north. I'll fetch some fresh." The ranchers watched that water too, Taya warned, but Silas was already mounting Bramble. "Don't you fret," he assured her. "I've been dodging trouble since before that boy was born." The ride to the creek took Silas through rolling hills painted golden by the setting sun. Bramble's hooves kicked up dust that hung in the still air behind them. At the creek, Silas filled several water skins, checking over his shoulder out of habit. That caution proved wise. As he secured the last water skin to his saddle, movement caught his eye. 3 riders sat their horses on a distant ridge, watching. Even at this distance, Silas recognized the same men who'd searched the cabin for Taya's deed. He mounted carefully, making no sudden moves. The riders didn't approach, but their message was clear. They knew what he was doing, and they weren't pleased. Silas turned Bramble toward camp, keeping his pace unhurried despite the prickle between his shoulder blades. Twilight had deepened to purple when he returned. Joseph lay on his blankets, still coughing. Taya had built a small fire, its flames casting dancing shadows on the tent walls. Relief flooded her face at the sight of the fresh water. "Here now," Silas said, helping Joseph sit up. "Small sips, that's the way." The boy drank carefully, color gradually returning to his cheeks. Taya touched the water skin with reverence, knowing its worth better than most. "I saw those ranch riders watching," Silas told her quietly after Joseph had drifted into an uneasy sleep. "They mean to cause trouble before the hearing." Taya nodded, her face grave in the firelight. "They think fear will make us run again." She looked at her sleeping son. "But this time we have proof of our rights, and help." The night had grown deep and dark beyond their small circle of firelight. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its cry lonely and wild. Silas added another stick to the fire, watching the sparks spiral upward toward the stars. "My mama taught me to pray in 2 languages," Taya said softly. "She said the Creator hears all tongues the same." She reached for Joseph's small Bible, its pages worn smooth with handling. "Would you pray with us, Silas?" Silas removed his hat, holding it respectfully in his weathered hands. It had been years since he'd prayed proper. "Give us strength for what's ahead, wisdom to face it right." He paused, then added, "And help us remember that justice flows like clean water meant for all." Though Silas couldn't understand the words, their meaning touched his heart. Here was a mother's love, a people's dignity. The fire crackled softly, and overhead, stars wheeled in their eternal dance. For this moment, at least, peace settled over their small camp. But Silas kept his rifle close, knowing tomorrow would bring its own battles. Dawn painted the sky in streaks of pink and gold as Silas rode. The morning air held a bite of frost, making his breath cloud in white puffs. He needed to gather his winter gear and give Bramble a proper rest before the hearing. The horse's hooves crunched through fallen leaves as they followed the familiar trail home. Rounding the last bend, his throat tightened. Against the pale morning sky, a thin column of smoke rose from where his cabin should be, not the friendly smoke of a cooking fire, but the acrid remains of destruction. "Easy now," he murmured to Bramble, who shifted nervously beneath him. The horse's nostrils flared at the lingering scent of smoke. As they drew closer, the full extent of the damage became clear. The cabin's roof had collapsed inward, its sturdy logs now just blackened bones against the foundation. Wisps of smoke still curled from the ruins, speaking to how recently the fire had burned. The smell of ash and scorched wood hung heavy in the air. Silas dismounted slowly. Everything he owned had been inside his mother's silver spoon. The journal he'd kept for 15 years, the worn Bible that had seen him through lonely winters. All gone now, reduced to ash and memory. "Lord above," he whispered, running a hand over Bramble's neck. The horse's usually sleek mane was singed on one side, telling its own story of a close encounter with the flames. Someone had tried to trap Bramble in the lean-to when they set the fire, but the clever horse had broken free. Silas picked his way through the ruins, looking for anything salvageable. His tin coffee pot lay twisted and blackened near where the hearth had been. The chair he'd made last spring was now just scattered chunks of charcoal. But what made his heart sink lowest was the space beneath the hearthstones where he'd hidden Taya's cedar chest, empty, kneeling in the ashes. Silas scooped up a handful, letting the gray powder sift through his fingers. All the proof of Taya's claim to the spring. The deed, the letters, her son's Bible with its pressed flowers, gone. Stolen by men who would destroy a widow's hope as easily as they'd burn down his home. "Damn my carelessness," he muttered, angry at himself for not finding a safer hiding place. He should have known the ranchers would search again, should have taken better precautions. Now Taya and Joseph might lose everything because he'd failed to protect their proof. Bramble nickered softly, nudging Silas's shoulder. The horse's gentle reminder pulled him from his dark thoughts. Standing, Silas brushed the ash from his hands and surveyed the destruction one last time. The ranchers had meant to break his spirit along with his home, scare him away from helping Taya instead. Their cruelty only strengthened his resolve. With nothing left to salvage, Silas led Bramble away from the smoking ruins. They needed to make camp before dark, and his horse needed tending. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they found a sheltered hollow near a small stream. Silas unsaddled Bramble, taking extra care as he checked the horse for any burns or injuries from the fire. "You're a brave one," he told the horse, cleaning the soot from his singed mane. Smarter than those men reckoned on too, as night settled over the land, Silas built a small fire. He had nothing but what he carried in his saddlebags. No blanket, no coffee pot, no extra ammunition. But he still had Bramble, his rifle, and most importantly, his word to Taya and her boy. Stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky as Silas leaned back against his saddle. The night wind carried the lonely call of a whippoorwill, reminding him of other nights spent under open sky. He'd survived with less before. What mattered now was seeing justice done. "Lord," he whispered into the darkness, "I ain't been much for prayin' lately, but that woman and her boy, they got faith enough for all of us. Help me find a way to make this right." He paused, watching sparks rise from his small fire. And if you're of a mind to put some sense into those ranchers' heads, well, that wouldn't go amiss either. Bramble grazed nearby, his familiar presence a comfort in the night. Silas added another stick to the fire, his mind already working on what to do next. The ranchers might have destroyed the physical proof, but they couldn't burn away the truth. Tomorrow, he would ride back to Taya, and together they would find another way. His word and her faith, maybe that would be enough. The fire crackled softly as Silas settled in for the night. His rifle close at hand, he had nothing left but conviction. But sometimes that was all a man needed to do what was right. First light crept over the horizon as Silas guided Bramble back toward the camp. His muscles ached from sleeping on hard ground, but worry for Taya and her boy drove him forward. The morning mist clung low to the earth, wreathing the scattered tents in gray shadows, As he approached Taya's tent, he heard coughing from within. The sound twisted his gut. The boy's condition hadn't improved. Taya emerged, her face drawn with exhaustion. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, testament to a sleepless night. When she saw Silas, relief softened her features. "I feared they might have found you too," she said softly, touching his arm in greeting. Silas dismounted, his boots pressing into the damp earth. "They tried. Burned my cabin to ash." He paused, dreading the next words. "Taya, the chest is gone. They took it before they set the fire." Her shoulders slumped as the news hit home. Inside the tent, her son Joseph coughed again, the sound harsh and wet. Taya pressed her lips together, fighting back tears. "The truth cannot be burned," she said finally, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "My father taught me that. Our stories live in more than paper and ink." Silas nodded, humbled by her strength. "I'll get it back. Those men think they can hide evidence, but they can't hide from justice." Forever, together they packed what little they had. A few blankets, Taya's cooking pot, medicines for Joseph. The boy could barely sit up, his small face flushed with fever. Silas helped wrap him in the warmest blanket before lifting him onto Bramble. The ride into town seemed longer with Joseph's labored, breathing marking each step. Townspeople paused in their morning routines to watch the strange procession. The mountain man, the Comanche woman, and the sick child. Some turned away, but others met their eyes with unexpected kindness. The preacher stood on the church steps as they passed, his kind face creasing with concern when he saw Joseph's condition. "Bring him inside," he called out, hurrying down to meet them. "The parish house is warm, and my wife knows something of nursing." Taya hesitated, years of mistrust warring with her son's need. Silas touched her shoulder gently. "The preacher's a good man. Joseph needs rest in a proper bed." After a moment, she nodded. The preacher helped carry Joseph into the small house beside the church, where his wife already bustled about, preparing a bed and heating water for tea. The room was simple but clean, with sunlight streaming through lace curtains. "God's mercy knows no boundaries," the preacher said softly as his wife tended to Joseph. "Rest here as long as you need." Taya sat beside her son's bed, smoothing his dark hair back from his forehead. Something in her fierce maternal devotion strengthened Silas's resolve. He waited until Joseph had fallen into an uneasy sleep before touching Taya's shoulder. "I'm going to ask around town," he told her. "Someone must know where they took the chest." The saloon was quiet in the late afternoon. Only a few regulars hunched over their glasses. Silas ordered coffee, listening to the murmured conversations around him. Men discussed cattle prices, the weather, the latest news from the telegraph office. But beneath it all ran an undercurrent of tension about the upcoming hearing. The barkeep, a weathered man with kind eyes, refilled Silas's cup without being asked. "Heard about your cabin," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "Ain't right burning a man out like that." Silas studied the man's face, weighing his words carefully. "Ain't right taking what belongs to others either. If a man was looking for something valuable, he might want to check the rancher's office." By the livery stable, he straightened up, wiping the counter with exaggerated care. "They keep all manner of important things locked up in there, or so I hear." Silas nodded slightly, understanding the risk the man took in sharing this information. He finished his coffee slowly, already forming plans in his mind. The livery stable sat at the edge of town, its weather-beaten walls casting long shadows in the evening light as he walked back to the parish house. Silas noticed ranch riders watching from across the street. They made no move to approach, but their presence sent a clear message. They thought they had one. That burning his cabin and stealing the chest would end this fight. Silas allowed himself a grim smile. They had badly misjudged both him and Taya. Sometimes the Lord's work required a man to be as wise as a serpent, even while remaining as gentle as a dove. Tonight, he would need to be both. Night settled over the town like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a stillness broken only by distant coyote calls. Silas led Bramble quietly through the shadows between buildings, keeping to the darkest patches where moonlight couldn't reach. The horse's hooves, usually loud on packed earth, fell softly as Silas guided him with gentle pressure on the reins. Near the livery stable, Silas tied Bramble to a hitching post in a sheltered alcove. "Stay quiet now, old friend," he whispered, patting the horse's neck. Bramble nickered softly in response. as if understanding the need for silence. The rancher's office stood apart from the livery, a squat building with a single window glowing yellow in the darkness. Silas crouched low, moving like a shadow across the open ground. His years in the mountains had taught him how to move without being seen, each step placed with deliberate care at the corner of the building. Silas pressed his back against rough wooden boards. The night air carried the scent of tobacco, smoke, and lamp oil. A crack between the wall planks offered a narrow view inside. Silas held his breath and peered through. The rancher sat at a desk, his face illuminated by a kerosene lamp. His fingers moved over papers spread before him, counting and sorting. Beside him, the cedar chest lay open, its contents scattered across the desktop. The sight of those precious items treated so carelessly made Silas's blood run hot. His hand moved to the pistol at his hip, fingers curling around the familiar grip. One shot would end this now. But Taya's words echoed in his mind, her prayers for peace, her quiet strength in the face of violence. He remembered her son Joseph, sick in bed at the parish house, and how revenge would solve nothing. Silas released his hold on the pistol. Violence bred only more violence. He'd seen enough of that in his years on the frontier. Instead, he settled in to wait. Watching through the crack as the rancher finished his counting minutes stretched like hours until finally the rancher gathered his coat. The lamp flickered out, plunging the office into darkness. Silas pressed deeper into the shadows as boot steps crunched on gravel, heading toward the distant glow of the saloon. When the sound faded, Silas moved. The door lock was simple, the kind meant to keep honest men honest. With practiced hands, he worked it open and slipped inside. Moonlight through the window provided just enough light to see. The cedar chest still sat open on the desk. Silas worked quickly, gathering the scattered papers. His fingers found the deed first, then the small Bible with its pressed flowers. Letters crinkled as he collected them, each one a piece of Taya's story. He placed everything back in the chest with careful reverence. The door hinges creaked as he stepped outside, making him freeze. For a heartbeat, all was silent. Then came the sound of horses approaching, riders making their evening rounds. "Who's there?" A sharp voice cut through the darkness. Silas clutched the chest tight and ran. Behind him, boots hit dirt as riders dismounted. He could hear their heavy steps pursuing, closing the distance. A hand grabbed his jacket. Silas spun, the chest held tight in his left arm. The ranch hand's fist swung wide. Silas ducked under it, driving his shoulder into the man's chest. They both went down hard. The second rider was closing in. Silas rolled, shoving his opponent away. His elbow caught the man's jaw, sending him sprawling. Without waiting to see if he would rise, Silas scrambled to his feet. "Bramble," he called, running for the hitching post. The horse was already pulling against his reins. Sensing trouble, Silas vaulted onto Bramble's back, chest secured in one arm. He kicked free the reins just as shouts erupted behind him. Bramble needed no urging. The horse leaped forward, powerful muscles bunching as he ran. They thundered down the dark street, past sleeping houses and closed shops. Behind them, Silas could hear the riders remounting, giving chase. But Bramble was fresh and fast, and Silas knew these trails better than any ranch hand. They plunged into the darkness beyond town, where the road disappeared into wild country. Bramble's sure feet found the path, carrying them away from pursuit and toward safety. The sounds of the chase grew fainter until only the rhythm of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind remained. Silas held the chest close, feeling its solid weight against his ribs. Inside were the proof of Taya's claim and the memories of her family saved not by violence, but by patience and resolve. The night wrapped around them like a protective cloak as they rode on. Guided by starlight and conviction, dawn painted the eastern sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold as Silas rode into the camp. His clothes were dusty from the night's ride, but triumph shone in his eyes. The cedar chest, safely cradled in his arms, represented more than just papers and keepsakes. It held a family's future. Taya stood outside her tent, dark eyes wide with disbelief as Silas dismounted. The preacher, who had arrived early to check on her sick boy, stepped forward to steady Bramble's reins. Silas carried the chest to where Taya waited, setting it carefully on a rough wooden table near her cooking fire. "You found it," Taya whispered, her fingers hovering over the familiar wood grain. "I feared it was lost forever, "The Lord provides ways," Silas said softly. Opening the lid, Taya's hands trembled as she lifted out the beaded blanket. She pressed the soft fabric to her chest, tears spilling down her cheeks. The morning light caught the tiny glass beads, making them sparkle like dewdrops. Her son Joseph, pale but awake, emerged from the tent and pressed against her side. "Mama's blanket," the boy said, touching one corner with reverent fingers, "the one grandmother made for me." The preacher stepped closer, watching as Taya showed Joseph the pressed flowers in the small Bible. "These documents deserve to be seen by all," he said. "Our congregation gathers every Sunday. Perhaps that would be the proper time to present your claim." Silas nodded slowly. The whole town together, no secrets, no shadows. "The judge agrees," the preacher continued. "He suggested as much when we spoke yesterday. Said public witness ensures fair dealing." He smiled kindly at Taya. "Many hearts might soften when they hear your story." Sister Taya straightened her shoulders, dignity evident in every line of her bearing. "I will speak my own words," she said firmly. "My people have always known the power of truth spoken aloud." The morning passed in careful preparation. Taya and Joseph sorted through the letters, arranging them in order. The preacher made notes for his introduction, while Silas tended to Bramble and kept watch for any sign of the ranch riders. As evening approached, the air grew chill. Joseph's cough returned, reminding them all of the urgent need for clean water. Silas shouldered his axe, gesturing toward the sparse woods beyond the camp. "Best gather firewood before dark," he said. "That tent gets mighty cold at night." Taya set aside her mending and rose. "I will help," she said, for hands work faster than two. They walked together through the scattered pine trees, gathering fallen branches. The setting sun cast long shadows across the ground, but its last rays caught the silver threading through Silas's dark hair, making it gleam. Taya found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the gentle way he stepped aside to let her pass. "My husband would have thanked you," she said suddenly, "for helping strangers when you could have ridden away." Silas paused in his work. "I reckon he was a good man." "He was." Taya's voice held both sorrow and pride. "He taught me that courage isn't always about fighting. Sometimes it's about standing firm, speaking truth." A stick snapped behind them. They turned to see Joseph approaching slowly, one hand steadying himself against tree trunks. Despite his weakness, the boy's eyes were bright with determination. "Mama!" he called. "Can I help too?" Before either adult could protest, Bramble appeared behind Joseph. The horse had followed the boy, keeping pace with his unsteady steps. Now Bramble nudged Joseph gently with his soft nose, making the child giggle. "Well, would you look at that?" Silas said, his weathered face creasing in a smile. Seems Bramble's appointed himself guardian. Taya's laughter joined her son's, the sound rising sweet and clear in the evening air. She gathered Joseph close, letting him lean against her as Bramble lipped playfully at the boy's dark hair. "Perhaps you could be Bramble's assistant," she suggested. "Help us carry small sticks while he watches over you." They worked together as the light faded, gathering enough wood to keep the fire burning through the night. Joseph collected twigs in his arms while Bramble stood patient guard. Taya and Silas shared the heavier loads, their movements falling into natural rhythm. Back at the tent, they built up the fire. Its warm light pushed back the gathering darkness, creating a circle of comfort. Joseph sat wrapped in his beaded blanket, one hand extended to stroke Bramble's velvet nose. The horse had refused to leave. Standing sentinel near the boy, Taya stirred the cooking pot, adding dried herbs that filled the air with savory fragrance. Silas sat nearby, whittling a small piece of pine. The quiet that settled between them felt easy, unforced. Above their heads, the first stars emerged in the deepening blue sky. Hope, fragile as a newly unfurled leaf, seemed to hover in the firelight. Sunday's meeting still loomed ahead with all its uncertainty. But for now, in this moment, peace wrapped around them like a familiar blanket, worn perhaps, but still warm, still strong enough to shelter dreams of justice and new beginnings. Sunday dawned clear and crisp, the autumn air sharp with wood smoke from morning fires. Townsfolk in their best clothes made their way along dirt paths toward the white-painted church, its bell tolling across the valley. Silas adjusted his worn but clean coat, watching as Taya braided her son Joseph's hair with trembling fingers. The boy's cough had eased, but worry still creased his mother's brow. "Remember what we practiced," Silas said softly. "Just speak your truth." Taya nodded, straightening the simple calico dress the preacher's wife had brought her. Joseph clutched his small Bible, its pages still holding pressed flowers from happier days. Inside the church, sunlight streamed through plain glass windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. Wooden pews creaked as settlers took their places. Ranch hands shuffled uncomfortably in boots, unused to Sunday polish, and town ladies whispered behind gloved hands. The cedar chest sat heavy in Silas's arms as he guided Taya and Joseph to a front pew. Preacher Anderson stepped to the pulpit, his Bible open before him. "Brothers and sisters," he began, voice carrying to the rafters, "today we gather not just for worship, but for justice. The good book speaks clear on this matter." His fingers traced the verses as he read. "Defend the poor and fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and needy." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Silas watched faces in the crowd, some troubled, others curious, a few already hardening with resistance. At the preacher's nod, he rose and carried the chest forward, setting it carefully on the altar. The worn wood seemed to glow in the morning light as he withdrew the deed and Joseph's Bible. "Before you stands a matter of conscience," Preacher Anderson continued. "A legally granted claim, a widow's right, a child's future." He gestured to Taya. "Sister, will you share your story? Sister, will you share your story?" Taya rose slowly, her dark eyes steady despite her obvious nervousness. Joseph pressed against her skirts as she faced the congregation. Her voice, though quiet, carried clearly in the hushed church. "7 years ago, my husband and I were granted rights to the spring land," she began. "We built our home there, planted gardens, raised our son." Her hand rested on Joseph's shoulder. "After the soldiers," she paused, steadying herself. "After my husband died, I continued working the land alone. The spring gave life to our gardens, clean water for our needs." She described the day ranch hands came, how they forced her family out, poisoned the well with dead animals. "My son grew sick from drinking tainted water in the camps," she said. "We had nowhere else to go." The silence in the church grew heavier. Several women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. A farmer's wife held her own child closer, face troubled. Suddenly, the church door banged open. Rancher Wade Matthews stormed down the aisle, face flushed with anger. "This is nothing but lies," he shouted. "That land's been ranch territory for generations. No Indian has rights to silence." Judge Harrison's voice cracked like a whip. The elderly judge rose from his pew, holding up one hand. "Mr. Matthews, this is God's house, and I'll thank you to remember it." He stepped forward, taking the deed from the altar. "This document bears the Indian Agency's seal and my own signature. The law is clear. The spring rights were legally granted to Mrs. Taya Redbird and her heirs." The rancher's face darkened, but before he could speak again, Preacher Anderson stepped between them. "Friends," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "we've all known loss. We've all faced hardship in this territory. But how we treat the widow, the fatherless, this is the measure of our Christian charity." He lifted Joseph's Bible, showing the pressed flowers. This child kept his faith even when driven from his home. Can we do less? Can we face our own children if we allow injustice to stand? Taya stood straight and dignified, one arm around her son. "I ask only for what is rightfully ours," she said. "The spring can support both my gardens and cattle. There is enough if we share with respect." An older settler woman stood suddenly. "I remember when you helped my Tommy," she said. "That fever last winter? Your herbs saved my boy." None of us knew it was you living in such hardship. Others nodded, memories stirring of quiet kindnesses given despite poverty. The preacher looked out over his congregation. "The choice before us is simple. Do we uphold what is legal and right? Do we show mercy as we hope to receive mercy?" A slow wave of nods spread through the pews. The rancher's face twisted, but he found himself increasingly alone as former supporters looked away. Shamed by their previous silence, Taya's quiet dignity had done what no amount of arguing could achieve. Hearts were turning, consciences awakening. The Sunday morning sun streamed stronger through the windows, touching the cedar chest like a blessing, warming the ancient words of justice spoken new again. "This ain't over." He reached for his gun belt, but 3 farmers stepped between him and Taya. More townspeople rose from their pews, forming a wall of quiet strength. Judge Harrison's voice rang out firm and clear. By the power vested in me, I confirm these spring rights belong to Mrs. Taya Redbird and her son. Any interference will be met with the full force of the law." Matthew spat on the floor and stormed out, leaving only the echo of boots and a slammed door. The preacher raised his hands, and the congregation bowed their heads in prayer for healing and protection over Taya's family. As afternoon sun warmed the valley, Silas rode alongside Taya toward her spring. Joseph sat before his mother, no longer coughing. They found the water flowing pure and sweet. No trace remaining of the rancher's poison. Taya slipped from her horse and knelt at the spring's edge. Her hands cupped the clear water like it was precious gold. "Drink, little one," she whispered, helping Joseph take his first clean sip in months. The boy's eyes brightened as he swallowed. Silas stood back, watching mother and child. The weight of past failures lifted from his shoulders like morning mist, replaced by a peace he hadn't known since losing his own family. Here, at last, was justice made right. The first snowflakes drifted down as Silas led Bramble up the familiar trail to the cabin. Taya and Joseph followed, their few belongings packed on a borrowed wagon. The old place stood waiting, its windows dark but promising shelter from the growing storm. "Time to bring this home back to life," Silas said, helping them unload. Together they worked through the afternoon. Silas patched holes in the roof while Taya swept years of dust from the corners. Joseph gathered kindling, his small boots leaving tracks in the fresh snow. Soon, smoke curled from the chimney, and lamplight glowed in windows that hadn't known warmth in seasons. The aroma of rabbit stew filled the cabin as evening settled in. Outside, Bramble's hooves made soft sounds in the gathering snow. Taya stirred the pot hanging over the hearth, her face glowing in the firelight. "This place," she whispered, looking around at the now tidy room, "it no longer feels empty. It feels like home again." Silas smiled, his heart full. After years of wandering alone, he had found more than justice, he had found belonging. Joseph scooted closer to him by the fire. "Uncle," he said softly, taking Silas's weathered hand in a small one. The words settled like a blessing. Together, they bowed their heads in prayer as snow continued falling outside, blanketing their world in peace and new beginnings. If you believe stories can heal, lift, and connect us, this channel is for you. Thanks for being here. Hit subscribe, and I'll meet you again tomorrow with something real.